You know when something major happens in life and some friend of yours is trying to cheer you up and says, "Don't worry, the world will keep spinning." In many countries in Latin America, people can say, "Así es la vida," or "Cógelo suave." In Brazil, we would say, "É a vida que segue." The U.S. election results have shaken up news everywhere, but the world of international politics and diplomacy, well, kept spinning, even with added anxiety. The past several weeks have featured a series of summits happening across the world, from the BRICS summit in Russia in October to the APEC summit happening in Peru from November 14 to 16 to the G20 in Rio de Janeiro this week on November 18 and 19. Not to mention COP29, the UN climate conference in Baku, Azerbaijan, that also happened this month. The only thing flying around more than world leaders these days might be declarations and hot takes on the state of international affairs, especially after the re-election of Donald Trump. How can we make sense of this all? How are these leaders, these global organizations, are navigating our new era? And where does Latin America fit into this picture? Welcome back to Latin American Focus. I'm Luisa Leme with ASCOA Online, and this November has been a month of major stories for the region. APEC in Peru came with a huge port inauguration in Shanghai, attended by no one else than Chinese President Xi Jinping. It's a port expected to generate $4.5 billion every year for Peru.
Muy importante desde Palacio de Gobierno la visita de Estado que realiza el presidente chino Xi Jinping. Aquí los detalles con nuestro compañero Edgardo Reto. Adelante.
Meanwhile, the G20 countries almost became G19 when Argentina's Javier Milei became an impediment on the negotiations to resolutions on world hunger, violence against women, and wars in Gaza and Ukraine, not to mention taxing the super rich.
Javier Milei, o presidente da Argentina, também foi o penúltimo a discursar. Foi discurso cheio de climão e com poucos aplausos.
Well, on this episode, we've assembled not a G20, but a G3. 3 guests, one from each Latin American country in the G20, Argentina, Brazil, and Mexico, recorded with my colleague Chase Harrison right before the summit started in Rio. Their conversation helps us piece together expectations on what countries can agree, how much of a white elephant Donald Trump is in these rooms, and the new playing field of China-US competition. You will hear from Cecilia Tornaghi, a Brazilian-American journalist who works with the Council of the Americas, on the choices Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva is facing as a host.
He's been banking on this as a way to showcase Brazil as a global player, but also showcasing his leadership across the country itself.
Then, from Argentina, you will hear from Francisco Resnicoff, former Undersecretary of International Relations of the city of Buenos Aires. He talks about Javier Milei's goals on the G20 right after a visit to Mar-a-Lago in Miami.
For Milei, this is huge, right? He sees himself as the Trump ally in Latin America.
And finally, Brenda Estefan, a Reforma columnist and professor at IPADE Business School, on Mexico's new president Claudia Sheinbaum's first international trip to the G20. That's big news in Mexico after her predecessor's 6 years absence from the international scene.
So having a new president who's willing to attend the summits, it's good news. Now, will she really depart from AMLO's positions? That remains to be seen.
These guests dig into why, as Brenda puts it, we're not in an era of changes, but a changing of eras. And quickly, thanks to our listeners all around the globe, from Tampa to Tampico to Tanzania. Write us a review, and if you haven't already, share this episode with another Latin America aficionado. Help us spread the word.
You're listening to Latin America in Focus.
Latinoamérica en Foco.
América Latina em Foco.
A podcast by America Society, Council of the Americas on politics, economics, and culture in the region.
We are just days out from the start of this year's G20, a gathering of the leaders of the world's largest economies. And this year, they'll be in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. It's a big moment for the president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And Cecilia, you're on the ground in Rio right now. What's the mood in the city? Is it G20 mania? And what are your expectations for the summit that we're about to start?
Chase, thank you so much for having me. It is G20 mania. We have a lot of events happening in the lead up to the main summit. The diplomats had their meetings, and then we had the G20 social happening, which brings social movements and civil society from across the spectrum, from oceans to favelas, completely different subjects, but are brought in by civil society. It's an innovation that Brazil brought in to the G20, which is this G20 social. So this is bringing a lot of energy and movement and interest around the city. Of course, if you walk around Rio and other areas, a lot of people are really in tune, and these social movements were invited to submit their proposals. So there was a lot of thought going in, different communiques of different areas. It's a very interesting moment. Of course, we have to remember G20 is what? We are 85% of global GDP, 75% of trade. So there's a lot to it. But of course, civil society is very, very interested in having their voice heightened at this forum.
This notion of bringing civil society in more, it sounds like this has been an initiative of Lula's government. What other major initiatives and expectations does Lula have to make this particularly a Brazilian summit?
Lula definitely had a lot of interest in heightening Brazil's global positioning using the G20. Of course, next year, Brazil will have the presidency of the BRICS as well. We have COP30, so there's a lot of things happening under his watch. But the G20 is a big, big global platform for him. He's been banking on this as a way to showcase Brazil as a global player, but also showcasing his leadership across the country itself. Joe Biden, the U.S. president, will have his first South America visit right now with APEC and G20. And this is something that he was definitely very keen on, bringing Joe Biden to the Amazon, which is going to happen.
World leaders are going to be traveling from all over to get to Rio. The leader who's perhaps traveling the shortest distance is Javier Milei, the president of Argentina. Some people were surprised that Milei is attending the summit at all. Francisco, why are people surprised that Milei is attending, and what does his attendance mean for Argentina?
He's such a difficult figure to grasp, right? He usually doesn't meet with other leaders. He usually, when he travels that he made, and he made a lot, he never met with his counterparts, other leaders. For example, he visited the U.S. in several occasions. He had no single meeting with the U.S. government. He met Trump, of course, and he met Elon Musk a couple of times. He went to Europe, and he went to kind of a political meeting, but without involving the presidents or prime ministers of those countries. The construction of his political character, his political career, has been mostly as a total outsider, which is actually true. Actually, there's truth to it. So he doesn't feel comfortable. He doesn't want to be seen surrounded by other leaders. So that's why I think there was some doubts about him attending. Plus the fact that he made out of Lula one of his main adversaries in the region, right? That this comes from the last year presidential campaign, in which Lula more or less clearly supported the adversary of Milei, and Milei portrayed Lula as a socialist and as a corrupt leader. There's a good degree of animosity between the two of them. He will attend. He will probably not have a lot of bilateral meetings, but he finally will attend the meeting.
I think him attending, I think that maybe he's emboldened with Trump's win in the U.S. or something, because I think that there is a added win for him here of actually hijacking the whole G20 and the wins for Lula. So a main concern here isn't, that Trump won and just everything, whatever they agree on may go downhill next year, but is the fact that Milei is already showing his path. So the new working group of women's equality and empowerment, Argentina basically said, nope, we don't agree. And then they came out with, for the first time, a G19 signatory issue because Argentina just said, nope, we're not in. And the G20 can only have a communique if it is a consensus. So there is a lot of, noise here as to whether he will maybe impede the consensus from happening.
Wow. We're going to open up the Pandora's box that is Trump in a second. But I wanted to quickly touch upon another perhaps surprising attendee of the G20 summit, and that's Mexico's new president, Claudia Sheinbaum. Her predecessor, Andres Manuel López Obrador, by and large did not leave Mexico. He did not attend international summits, aside from a few exceptions. So, Brenda, what does it mean that Claudia decided to attend the G20? Does this signify some sort of break from AMLO?
Well, I think it's refreshing, Chase, because we've come from 6 years of a president who traveled only 7 times abroad. Along those 6 years, he only spent 16 days abroad. So that signals clearly that he disregarded foreign policy. So having a new president who's willing to attend the summits, it's good news. Now, will she really depart from AMLO's positions? That remains to be seen. From what we've seen along this month, that doesn't seem the case. She inherited clearly a lot of tensions with different countries around the world, like the U.S., Canada, Peru, Ecuador, Spain. And she doesn't seem to be making any effort to rebuild those relationships. On the contrary, we saw her even before taking office, having some conflicts already with Spain by not inviting the King of Spain to her inauguration in Mexico City. And what we've known so far about the content of what she's willing to bring to the table is not much, apart from the fact that she's willing to promote flagship social program from her political party, Morena, and the previous president, López Obrador, which is called Sembrando Vidas. This program's aim is to reduce poverty and promote a green agenda by providing support to small-scale agricultural producers. The thing is, even in Mexico, it's a program that receives a lot of public funding, but it still has to yield significant results. So it doesn't seem like a good presentation card to go on the international arena for Claudia Sheinbaum. I think Mexico's international footprint has shrinked along the past 6 years. If you are not in these sort of tables, you could be part of the menu. So it's good to know that she's going to be there. But we still want to see what are going to be her positions, especially given that some of the other countries that are going to be present, as I mentioned before, have tense relationships or sour relationships with Mexico City at the current times.
You brought up who's at the table. One person who's not at the table, but who is looming large over the summit, is the recently reelected President of the United States, Donald Trump, who will take office in January. Trump has been a critic of multilateralism. He's been a critic of international forums like the United Nations. He has a polarized view of foreign policy. I want to start with Francisco. There's perhaps no one at the summit who might be happier with the reelection of Trump than Javier Milei. How does his approach to the G20 change with this reelection?
For Milei, this is huge, right? He sees himself as the Trump ally in Latin America, or an ally in pursuing U.S. interests in Latin America. He already did or made some moves in that direction. He, for example, an event which was very well promoted by himself, he traveled to Tierra del Fuego, he as a president, to meet with General Richardson, who is the U.S. South Commander, in a clear attempt to show that he's with the U.S. and not with China. For him, it's a huge bet. He will try to, in a way, be the voice and eyes and ears of Trump in this G20. There's a significant event that happened a couple of days ago. He spoke with Trump over the phone. After that call, the Argentine delegation to COP, which is happening right now at Azerbaijan, of course, the Argentine delegation was arguing that ideology should not be the main drive of positions of countries, trying to accommodate what Milei thinks about climate change at that summit. But there was a delegation until yesterday. Yesterday, Argentina decided to say to the delegation that they should not be in the premises anymore. They should not attend any meeting and they should not negotiate. So that happened after that talk between the two of them.
Javier Milei, as you noted, is probably enthusiastic about Trump's reelection, but I think a lot of other leaders in Latin America are rather worried. Why? Because Trump has made threats towards Latin America. He's talked about tariffs. He's used his bully pulpit to speak on domestic issues he feels are being mishandled in the region. Brenda, I wanted to get your take on how Latin America as a region might respond to a Trump presidency. What does his reelection mean for the unity of the region?
Well, one thing that's interesting, Chase, is that for many years, Latin America seemed to be not a priority for the White House. But with the nomination of Marco Rubio as potentially the new Secretary of State, I think this is shifting. Rubio has been a key figure of the Republican Party in terms of foreign affairs and particularly towards Latin America. His positions against the Cuban and the Venezuelan regime are well known. So maybe that will have an impact on the relationships in between different countries in the region and the U.S., given that, for example, Mexico has been a staunch supporter of these two governments in the past 6 years. There's going to be a lot more pressure coming from the White House towards Latin American governments regarding Venezuela and Cuba, and probably in a lower level Nicaragua, but as well in the list. Latin America has to realize that this is not something transitory. I've heard some comments of people saying we just need to be able to cope with Trump for the next 4 years. I don't think that's the case. I think even if Trump leaves, Trumpism is here to stay. So Latin America is going to have to be able to deal with this new rhetoric that has gained traction among electors in the U.S. That's basically more strict border restrictions, a policy that's very restrictive vis-a-vis migration. Also, obviously, for Mexico, the case for drug cartels, fentanyl crossing the border. That one thing that has been changing with Trump is that for many years, most of the countries in Latin America, especially the ones that have a strong relationship with the U.S., tended to separate topics. So if one would discuss economy or trade, it was only that agenda. If it was security, it was only that agenda. But Trump likes to put everything in one basket. So the region needs to deal with all these different topics, migration, security, and trade, in the same negotiation tables. The Latin American countries are going to have to adjust their negotiation teams to cope with this new reality, where they're going to have at the table of the USMCA negotiations people who know about security and migration, because the negotiations are going to be about that three topics in a whole, and they're going to be key to Trump's government. I have the impression that a lot of the leaders in the region are playing business as usual, but I think this is a big shift, and we need to not only adjust, but have a strategy to deal with this new era.
Cecilia, I'm going to ask you a question, but do you want to just comment?
Yeah, I wanted to comment because I think that what Brenda said is perfect. And there is one added element especially for South America, with the China element. Because if tariffs go on to China, our economies in South America are going to feel that as well. Not only the pressure to do or not do business with China, but the actual reality of China facing larger tariffs in the U.S. and how is that going to play into our exports.
We tend to think that South America has, of course, a stronger relationship with China, but in the recent years, the Chinese investments in Mexico have grown tremendously. We've seen that worry reflect in the White House and in Washington at large. So definitely with Marco Rubio in the Department of State, who's a very anti-China figure, we're going to feel that pressure also in Mexico, because even if Chinese presence is not that big, not only has it been gaining traction, but also it's in key sectors that could be crucial to U.S. national security.
And just before G20, there'll be a meeting of APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. Mexico is the only country in Latin America that's in both groups. What will you be watching for in terms of APEC to see how it impacts the G20, especially with this notion of U.S. and Chinese cooperation?
One of the things that is going to happen is in a way, theatrics. As Cecilia said, Biden is doing his first trip to Latin America. Xi Jinping did several, I think 11 or something like that. And in this trip, not only is the first one, it's going to be the last one. He will coexist with Xi Jinping, who comes with a huge delegation and who comes to inaugurate a huge mega port in Shanghai, which might be a game changer for trade of several products for several countries. So the theatrics of the summit play in China's advantage in this way, right? And I don't think that's a minor issue. I think that's telling, and that's going to inform in a way that the incoming administration, the Trump administration. So the China issue will be huge, and Xi Jinping will make sure of make a big impression both in G20 and in the APEC summit.
Theatrics, I think, is just a key word, right? I'm sorry, but it's just a key word. Can you imagine? Because you have Joe Biden as a lame duck coming for the first time to South America, and then Xi Jinping in both meetings. They are both going to be in APEC and the G20. So just that picture, of who will be left to talk to the waiters as opposed to having, bilaterals, it will be a very interesting moment.
And I think what Cecilia says is just right, because the center of power has shifted to Mar-a-Lago. So world leaders are not looking to the White House now. They're looking to Mar-a-Lago. That's where things are happening. And that's the person they want to talk to. But besides that, one needs to acknowledge that along these past few years, the relationship between Biden and Xi has been on and off. In August 2022, when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, there was a big tension. The communications were stopped by China. Then in November in Bali, in the sidelines of the G20 meeting, they met again, and they sort of agreed on how to be in disagreement. And then again, we had the Chinese balloon in February 2023, which also created a lot of tension. And then again, in San Francisco, both leaders met. But I think regardless of who is in the White House, it's good to have some communication in between the two big powers. Because if we compare these two to the Cold War, one thing that's very different, apart from the trade relationship in between China and the US, the other thing that's very different is that the playbook of how to disagree is way more in blank during this period of time. And that puts the world as a whole in a risky situation.
Well, let me ask this. In the past, Latin America has been able to shake both Biden and Xi's hands in the sense that the region has had economic partnerships. It's had diplomatic partnerships with both China and the United States. Are we entering an era where countries are not going to be able to pull off this feat?
I'm not sure either country at this point has what it takes to actually hold anyone back, because I don't think it's in China's interest to actually be, playing favors or anything. They just want to do deals. Trump is very transactional, as we mentioned before, but also, how much power he does have at this point when, even though, U.S. investments in the region are huge, they are by private companies that have private interests, and so it's a more difficult moment for pressuring countries. At the same time, I want to highlight that Brazil was expected to sign into the Belt and Road Initiative during the G20, and they backed down.
Cecilia, let me just stick with you for one moment. President Lula of Brazil has tried to, in his third term, present himself as this elder statesman, someone who's able to talk to multiple sides. How has Trump's election changed Lula's calculation in the way that he's trying to approach foreign affairs?
I think that with the BRICS, the larger BRICS, the BRICS Plus, Lula lost a lot of his sway over that group. So his positioning of, asserting that the group is not a, anti-Western, and, it's himself positioning and him saying that, as opposed to actually having a lot of input. It's more of a China game right now for the BRICS. It used to be more, equal in a sense, and now it's harder for Lula to have a say. But What Lula is also facing is a very difficult domestic situation. So his global positioning, which was his idea, of showing, he has a natural tendency to do that, right? To lead on things that he believes in. But the domestic situation is very, very dire. He doesn't have Congress. Congress is way more powerful. So it's very, very difficult, even though we have GDPs growing and so on and so forth. The perception of the public is that things aren't that good.
Cecilia, I'm not sure if you agree with me, but I think that the global role that Lula thought about himself for his third term as a president, as an elderly leader and kind of sharing his wisdom with the rest of the world and all that I think it came from the two first periods. It quickly hit a wall, basically, or two walls, I would say. The first one is related to the Ukrainian conflict, the Ukrainian-Russia war, in which he tried to have a mediator role, and that was interpreted at the end as favoring the Russian position. And the other one, which was much closer, was the Venezuelan conflict after the stolen elections of Maduro, right? He tried again to be the chief negotiator and to try to find a way out. And I think he had good intentions regarding that. That quickly became very difficult to do because of Maduro, basically. So that effort also hit a wall. So I think the difficulties of the foreign policy of Lula himself, his presidential diplomacy role, failed, not now after Trump election, but maybe before, right? The last year or so.
For Brazil, Russia is beyond being, the BRICS, the relationship. It's also a major fertilizer provider for Brazil, and we do need their fertilizer. And Brazilian foreign policy has always been to talk to everyone, so they use that as a sort of means, but also we need the Russian fertilizer. But then, you have with Gaza, Lula is a persona non grata now because he spoke up against Israel's actions in Gaza, even though he does condemn the attack of October 7th. And in Venezuela now, we have his main policy advisor, for foreign policy advisor, as a persona non grata in Venezuela for taking a stance. So it's a tightrope for Brazil that has this policy of talking to everyone.
What about Mexico? Did the Ukraine invasion change Mexico's calculus in international affairs?
Mexico's position regarding the war in Ukraine has been very dubious, to say the least. So we have a position at the UN General Assembly which condemns the Russian invasion. But in terms of the political discourse, there has always been a lot of flirting with the Russian position and the Russian propaganda. And I believe that it's not in the best interest of Mexico. It's purely ideological, given that Mexico has barely any trade with Russia. It has no geopolitical alliances like Brazil does with the BRICS. And for instance, Brazil gained some traction in exporting grains with the war in Ukraine, but Mexico gained nothing out of it. So it seems like counterintuitive, and I think Mexico has to still define what it's going to be its foreign affairs vision in this new era, because we think of this as an era of changes, but it's basically more a change of era. And I think Mexico needs to define what it's going to be its position. If it's not going to join BRICS because clearly it's not in its interest. It's, this group of countries represents nearly 50% of the global population and almost a third of global GDP, but still it's more an idea that needs to be crystallized with facts. It's far from being something tangible like the USMCA for Mexico. So I think in the Mexican interest, it's clear where it's standing in terms of geopolitical changes that we're seeing. But in the political discourse, we haven't seen that translated into the political discourse. And with the Trump administration, I think the pressure for Mexico to take a position clearly, especially regarding things like Venezuela, it's going to be higher. The situation in Ukraine, it might not be that much because it's not centered to the Trump's presidency. But definitely, Mexico needs to rethink, restructure its strategy towards North America and towards the rest of the world. Mexico is not playing in the two fields. It's merely not playing.
Brenda, I loved that quotation. We're not in an era of changes, we're in a change of era. Thank you so much for coming here to our little podcast summit.
Thank you for having us, Chase.
Thank you. Thank you, Chase.
Thank you so much. It was great.
Thank you for listening. I'm your host, Luisa Lemi. This episode was produced by our associate producer, Fabricio Ricalde. The music in this podcast is Espinha de Bacalhau, performed by Solar for America Society. You can watch them and other artists at the America Society Council of the Americas YouTube channel. Find out about upcoming concerts happening here at America Society New York at musicoftheamericas.org. If you listen up to this point, you will enjoy other episodes of Latin America in Focus. You can find them at www.as-coa.org/podcast. Or write us an email telling what you think of this episode, latinfocus@as-coa.org. Share and subscribe at Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or whatever you listen to your podcasts. Opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of America Society, Council of the Americas, or its members. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more, visit as-coa.org.